The silver dollar hit the auction platform with a sound like a gunshot. One coin for a human life the crowd had already decided was worthless. Martha Callahan stood in chains while men laughed at the idea of bidding on a woman too old to work, too broken to matter. But when the quiet rancher tore that contract in half and set her free, he ignited a war that would burn through the desert territory and force them both to discover that some lives are worth more than any price, and some debts can only be paid in blood. Stay with me until the end of this story, hit that like button, and comment your city below so I can see how far Martha and Daniel's journey travels across the world. The morning sun hit Mercy Wells like a punishment, turning the dusty main street into a ribbon of scorched earth that shimmered in waves of heat. The town squatted at the edge of the territorial desert, a collection of weathered buildings that looked like they'd been carved from the same red stone as the canyon walls beyond. 53 souls called it home, though that number changed depending on the season, the silver strikes, and how many men the desert claimed in any given month. On this particular Tuesday in August of 1887, the population had swelled to nearly 80, not because of prosperity or celebration, but because of the auction. The platform stood in front of the territorial courthouse, a structure that claimed authority through height rather than justice. Rough-cut pine boards formed a stage elevated 3 feet above the street, forcing anyone standing on it to meet the eyes of the crowd, whether they wanted to or not. A single post rose from the center, iron rings bolted at intervals up its length. The wood was dark with old stains that no amount of desert sun had managed to bleach away. Martha Callahan stood with her wrist shackled to one of those rings. Her gray hair hung loose around her shoulders, tangled and dull with dust. The dress she wore had once been blue calico, the kind a respectable woman might have worn to church or a town social. Now it was the color of ash, torn at the hem and stained with sweat and red earth. Her face was weathered like canyon stone, deep lines carved around her eyes and mouth by years that had offered more hardship than mercy. She was 63 years old, though she looked older. The frontier had a way of adding decades to a person's face while they were still breathing. But her eyes were different. They were gray like winter sky, sharp and clear, and they swept across the crowd with a kind of fierce awareness that made more than one man look away. There was no pleading in those eyes, no tears, just a cold assessment of every face, every sneer, every calculated glance that tried to determine her value in silver and cents. The auctioneer was a heavy man named Horace Talmadge, who made his living traveling between frontier settlements, selling everything from cattle to mining equipment to human contracts. He stood beside Martha now, mopping sweat from his fleshy face with a stained handkerchief, squinting against the glare. "All right, settle down now," he called, his voice carrying the practiced boom of a man accustomed to making himself heard over crowds. "Let's get this done before the heat makes us all stupid. Next item is a labor contract, standard territorial terms. 5-year obligation, room and board provided by the contract holder, wages set at territorial minimum." He gestured toward Martha without looking at her, the way a man might indicate a piece of furniture. "Female, age," he consulted a ledger, frowning. 63. Previous employment as household staff and laundry. Currently held under a territorial vagrancy statute, ready for immediate transfer to any qualifying bidder. Someone in the crowd laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that was picked up by others until it rippled through the gathering like wind through dead grass. "You serious, Horace?" a man called out. "Who the hell's gonna bid on a woman that old? She looks like she'd break in half if you set her to real work." "She can wash and cook, can't she?" another voice added, "though I reckon even that's questionable at her age." More laughter. Martha's expression didn't change. She stood perfectly still, her free hand hanging loose at her side, and watched them laugh. The iron shackle bit into her wrist when she shifted her weight, but she didn't acknowledge the pain. Talmadge cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but determined to proceed. This was business, and business moved forward regardless of dignity or its absence. "Starting bid set at $10 silver," he announced. "That's well below standard rate, gentlemen, in consideration of the age factor. But she's able-bodied enough for household work, and the contract's legal and binding. Do I hear 10? Silence answered him. The crowd had stopped laughing, but not because they were considering the bid. They were waiting to see how far this particular humiliation would go. Talmadge's face darkened. "Come now, $10 for 5 years of labor? That's $2 a year less than you'd pay a half-wit boy. Someone here must need help with cooking or laundry." I need help, a woman's voice called from the back, but I need someone who won't die before the week's out. The laughter came again, louder this time. A few men actually slapped their knees. One older gentleman shook his head and turned away, disgust evident in the set of his shoulders, but he didn't speak. Disgust without action was just another form of silence. $8, Talmadge said, dropping the price. $8 silver for a binding contract. That's practically nothing, gentlemen. A young man in dusty ranch clothes leaned against a porch post, arms crossed. Horace, I got a lame horse I'd give you $8 for. At least the horse might recover. More laughter. Martha closed her eyes briefly, just for a moment, and when she opened them again they held the same hard clarity as before. But something in her jaw had tightened, a small shift in the muscle that suggested she was grinding her teeth against words she refused to release. The sun climbed higher, heat pressed down on the platform like a physical weight. Talmadge's handkerchief was soaked through, his collar dark with sweat. He looked genuinely pained now, caught between the requirements of his profession and the reality that this particular piece of business was unsellable. $5, he said quietly. $5 silver. Final offer before I record this as a failed sale. The crowd had grown quieter, the humor draining out of the situation and leaving behind only the sour taste of collective cruelty. A few people were leaving now, heading back to their daily routines, having extracted what entertainment they could from the spectacle. $1. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, quiet but clear. Not shouted, not performed for effect, just stated as simple fact. Every head turned. The man who'd spoken was standing apart from the main gathering, half in shadow under the overhang of the dry goods store. He was tall but not imposing, lean in the way of men who worked the land rather than dominated it. His clothes were clean but worn, dark trousers, a shirt that had been washed until the blue had faded to gray, a vest with careful patches at the seams. His hat was pulled low, but beneath the brim his face was weathered and angular, with eyes the color of creek water under shadow. He looked to be in his late 40s, though the frontier made precise age difficult to determine. His hands hung relaxed at his sides, and there was something about his stillness that suggested he was entirely comfortable being the focus of sudden attention. Talmadge blinked. "I'm sorry, what was that?" The man stepped forward into full sunlight. $1, he repeated. Silver for the contract. A moment of stunned silence, then someone started laughing again. But it was different now. Uncertain, almost nervous. "You're joking," a heavy-set merchant said. "You're actually going to—" $1 silver, the man said again, his voice patient. "That's my bid. You going to take it or not?" Talmadge looked at Martha, then back at the man. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but this is a legal contract we're discussing. 5 years of labor obligation. You understand you'd be responsible for housing, food, medical care if needed. I understand the terms. And you're offering $1. I am." The auctioneer's face worked through several expressions, landing somewhere between confusion and relief. "Well, there's no competing bid, so technically—" He glanced at the crowd as if hoping someone would object, provide a reason to refuse this bizarre transaction. No one spoke. "Sold then," Talmadge said finally, the word coming out flat and uncertain. $1 silver to, he looked at the man expectantly. "Daniel Carter." "To Mr. Daniel Carter." Talmadge produced a key from his vest pocket and moved to unlock Martha's shackle. His hand shook slightly as he worked the lock. When the iron fell away, Martha rubbed her wrist slowly, her eyes fixed on the man who just purchased 5 years of her life for the price of a drink. Daniel Carter climbed the platform steps with measured movements. He pulled a silver dollar from his pocket. It caught the light as he turned it over, showing both faces to Talmadge before setting it on the auctioneer's ledger. "I'll need the contract," Daniel said. Talmadge nodded, relieved to be following familiar procedure again. He produced a folded document from inside his coat, marked with official territorial seals and dents with legal script. "You'll need to sign here, acknowledging receipt and accepting terms of obligation." Daniel took the contract. He looked at it for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with the same measured deliberation he'd shown in everything else, he gripped the paper in both hands and tore it in half. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. He tore it again, and again. The pieces fluttered to the platform like oversized confetti, coming to rest around his boots and Martha's worn shoes. "What the hell?" Talmadge started, his face going purple. Daniel looked at Martha. "You're free to go, ma'am. No contract, no obligation." He touched the brim of his hat in a slight gesture of respect. "I apologize that it took even $1 to make that happen." Then he turned and walked off the platform, his boots striking the steps with the same steady rhythm as his heartbeat. The crowd exploded into noise, shouts, questions, confused anger from those who felt somehow cheated of a resolution they couldn't even name. Talmadge was yelling something about legal documents and territorial law, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Martha stood frozen on the platform, pieces of torn contracts scattered around her feet like snow. Her mouth had fallen slightly open, the first break in her careful composure since the auction began. She watched Daniel Carter's back as he walked away, heading down the main street with the same unhurried pace that had carried him forward to bid. "Wait!" The word tore from her throat before she could stop it. Daniel paused but didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was patient, as if he'd been expecting the question. Martha descended the platform steps, her legs unsteady after standing so long. She caught herself on the rail, then straightened with visible effort, refusing to show weakness. She walked to where Daniel stood and looked up at him, trying to read something in his weathered face that would make sense of what had just happened. "Why?" Her voice was rough from disuse and thirst. "Why did you do that?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. The noise of the crowd had faded to background murmur as people drifted away, already transforming the event into gossip they'd share over dinner. The two of them stood in a small pocket of stillness in the middle of the dusty street. "Once," Daniel said finally, "I had a chance to help someone who needed it. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that getting involved would only make things worse." He looked past Martha toward the desert horizon, where heat shimmer made the distant canyon walls waver like water. "I was wrong, and by the time I figured that out, it was too late to fix it." He brought his gaze back to Martha's face. "I won't make that mistake again." "I'm an old woman," Martha said, and there was no self-pity in the words, just brutal fact. "Whatever you're trying to redeem, spending $1 on someone the world's already decided is worthless won't do it." Something that might have been pain flickered across Daniel's face, gone so quickly Martha almost missed it. "The world's decided wrong before," he said. "As for worth, you're standing here breathing. That seems like a good start." He touched his hat brim again. "There's a ranch about 2 hours north of here, just past the canyon road. If you need a place to rest before you decide where you're headed, you're welcome to it. No obligation, no contract." A slight, sad smile, not even $1's worth. Then he turned again and walked to where a horse stood hitched outside the general store, a sturdy bay mare with patient eyes. He mounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on the ground, gathered the reins, and rode north without looking back. Martha stood in the street long after he'd disappeared into the heat shimmer. The silver dollar sat on Talmadge's ledger where Daniel had left it, winking in the sun. The torn pieces of contract stirred in a slight breeze, some of them catching against the platform post where she'd been shackled. People were staring at her. She could feel their eyes, their confusion and judgment and curious pity. An old woman freed by a stranger for reasons no one understood, standing alone in the street with no plan and no destination. She'd been in worse situations. Martha turned north in the direction Daniel Carter had ridden and started walking. The canyon road was exactly what it sounded like, a narrow track carved between walls of red stone that rose like cathedral buttresses on either side. The passage was barely wide enough for a wagon, and in places the rock leaned so far inward that the sky became a ribbon of blue overhead. The air was cooler here, shaded from direct sun, but it carried an odd quality of stillness that made every footfall seem loud. Martha had walked for an hour before she'd found the road, following wagon ruts and horse tracks through scrub brush and alkali flat. The sun had moved past its zenith now, beginning the long slide toward evening, and shadows were growing longer. Her feet hurt. Her back hurt. The dress stuck to her skin with sweat, and her throat was so dry she couldn't swallow without pain. But she kept walking. She'd learned long ago that stopping was how you died. As long as you kept moving, you had a chance. It might be a slim chance, might be the kind of odds that would make a gambling man laugh, but it was something. And something was always better than the nothing that waited in stillness. The canyon walls gave way gradually to open country, rolling land covered in sage and bunch grass, cut through with dry washes that would run full during rare rains. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky. And there, perhaps a mile ahead, she could see buildings. The ranch was small, a main house that looked like it had started as a single room and grown in sections as need demanded. A barn with a sloped roof, corrals made of weathered pine, a windmill turning slowly in the breeze that was picking up as evening approached. It all had the look of a place maintained by one man's careful attention rather than abundant resources. Martha stopped walking. For the first time since leaving Mercy Wells, she allowed herself to consider what she was doing. This man, this Daniel Carter, was a stranger. She knew nothing about him except that he'd spent $1 to free her from a contract and then destroyed that contract without asking anything in return, which meant either he was genuinely kind, which was rare enough to be suspicious, or he had plans he hadn't revealed yet, which was far more common and considerably more dangerous. She should turn around. Find a different direction, a different destination. She'd survived 63 years on the frontier by learning to recognize when a situation had the shape of a trap. And this, a strange man offering help to a woman with no resources or protections, had that shape. But her feet hurt, and her throat burned with thirst, and the sun was lowering toward the horizon, and she knew what the desert became after dark. One night, she told herself, she'd accept water and maybe a place to sleep, and in the morning she'd leave and figure out what came next. One night wasn't a debt she couldn't walk away from. Martha started moving again. Daniel was in the corral when she arrived, working with a young horse that looked green-broke and nervous. He was patient with it, working the lead rope and talking in a low voice she couldn't quite hear from the distance. The horse circled and shied, but Daniel didn't pull hard on the rope or raise his voice. He just waited, let the animal settle, then asked again. He looked up when Martha's shadow fell across the fence rails. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Wasn't sure you'd come," Daniel said finally. "Wasn't sure myself." Martha's voice cracked on the words. She tried to swallow and couldn't. Daniel tied off the lead rope and crossed to the fence. "There's a pump behind the house," he said. "Water's good and cold. Help yourself." He didn't offer to show her, didn't hover or watch to make sure she found it, just gave the direction and went back to working the horse. The small gesture of trust, or possibly indifference, loosened something tight in Martha's chest. The pump was exactly where he'd said, an iron mechanism that groaned when she worked the handle. The water that came out was so cold it made her teeth ache, but she drank until her stomach cramped, then pumped more and splashed it over her face and neck. The simple relief of it was almost enough to make her weep. When she came back around the house, Daniel had turned the young horse loose in the corral and was carrying tack toward the barn. Martha stood in the yard, uncertain, waiting for instructions or dismissal or whatever would come next. Daniel emerged from the barn without the tack. "You hungry?" The question was so ordinary, so removed from contracts and auctions and the weight of obligation that Martha almost laughed. "Yes." "Kitchen's through there." He nodded toward the main house. "Nothing fancy, but there's beans and cornbread from this morning. Salt pork if you want it. Stove's still warm." "Where will you eat?" He looked genuinely confused by the question. "Same place. Kitchen table's big enough for 2. Martha followed him inside. The house was spare but clean. One large room that served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A table made from rough-cut pine. 2 chairs that didn't match. Shelves holding dishes and provisions. A door led to what she assumed was a bedroom, closed now. Everything spoke of utility and careful maintenance rather than comfort or aesthetic. Daniel moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing alone. He set out plates, divided the cornbread, spooned beans from a pot that sat at the edge of the stove. The movements were practiced, requiring no thought. They ate in silence at first. The food was simple but good, properly seasoned, and Martha ate until the hollow ache in her stomach finally eased. Through the window, she could see the last of the sunlight painting the canyon walls copper and gold. "There's a room," Daniel said eventually, not looking up from his plate. Other side of that wall there. Used to be storage, but it's got a cot and a window that opens. Door locks from the inside. He paused. I don't have a key to that lock, just so you know. Martha set down her fork carefully. Why are you doing this? Told you already. You told me about a mistake. That's not the same as an explanation. Daniel pushed beans around his plate with the edge of his cornbread. My sister, he said finally. Younger than me by 5 years. Our parents died when I was 17. She was 12. I was supposed to look after her. He was quiet for a moment. Man came through town when she was 16. Charming, promising. Said he was headed to California, had prospects there. She wanted to go with him. Martha waited. I told her no, Daniel continued. Said she was too young, didn't know what she was getting into. We fought about it for weeks. Finally, she left anyway, middle of the night. Took our mother's jewelry and the little bit of money we had, left me a note saying she knew what she was doing and I should stop treating her like a child. He looked at Martha now, and she saw old pain in his face, worn smooth by years but still present. Found out later the man wasn't headed to California at all. He was running contracts, what they used to call the trade before the laws changed. Moved young women to mining camps, promised them legitimate work, and then sold them into something else entirely. Daniel's jaw tightened. By the time I tracked her down, she'd been gone for 3 months. The things that happened in those 3 months? He trailed off. Martha could fill in the silence well enough. She died 2 years later, Daniel said. Sick. Worn out. Only 23 years old, and she looked 50. He met Martha's eyes. When I found her, she asked me why I hadn't come sooner, why I'd let her go in the first place when I knew, had to have known, what kind of man he was. You couldn't have stopped her if she was determined to go, Martha said quietly. Maybe not, but I could have tried harder, could have followed sooner, could have done something other than deciding it wasn't my problem once she'd made her choice. He pushed his plate away, the food half finished. So when I see someone standing on an auction block, shackled and mocked, while people walk away because it's easier than helping, his voice went flat. I won't be one of those people anymore. Not ever. The room settled into quiet again. Outside, evening insects had started their chorus. The windmill's steady creak provided rhythm. I appreciate what you did, Martha said. Truly. But I'm not your sister, and freeing me won't bring her back. I know that. Do you? Martha leaned forward slightly. Because what I'm hearing is a man trying to fix the past by throwing money at the present. $1 here, one rescued woman there. How many times are you going to do this before you figure out it doesn't actually change what happened? Daniel's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes sharpened. How many times have you been bought and sold, Mrs. Callahan? The question hit harder than Martha expected. That's not 4th time? 5th? I saw the scars on your wrist when they took off the shackle. Old scars. You've worn chains before. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath now. So maybe you're right. Maybe I'm just trying to fix something that can't be fixed. But you're still sitting at my table eating food you didn't have an hour ago, and in a few minutes you'll sleep in a room with a door that locks, and tomorrow morning you can leave or stay as you see fit. If that's meaningless to you, then we don't have much to talk about. Martha stared at him. Then, surprising herself, she laughed, a short, rough sound that held no humor but also no malice. You've got spine, she said. I'll give you that. Is that a yes or a no? To what? Staying the night. Martha considered the room, the food, the water from the pump. The alternative was walking back into the desert with no destination and no resources, hoping she'd find something before thirst or cold or simply exhaustion claimed her. Pride was expensive, sometimes too expensive to afford. One night, she said. Then we'll see. Daniel nodded once, accepting the terms. Rooms through there, wash basin on the stand, and there's an extra quilt in the chest if you get cold. I'll be up with the sun if you want breakfast before you go. He stood and gathered the dishes, moving to the wash basin built into the wall. Martha watched him for a moment. This strange, quiet man who'd spent $1 to free her and torn up a contract without asking for anything in return, who spoke of old guilt and dead sisters with the same measured tone he used to discuss cornbread and quilts. She didn't trust him. Not really. Trust was another expensive luxury the frontier had taught her to ration carefully. But she believed him about the door lock, and about the water, and about breakfast. Sometimes that was enough to start with. Martha stood and moved to the door he'd indicated. It opened onto a small room, barely 10 feet square, with a narrow cot against one wall and a window that looked out toward the mountains. The door did indeed have a lock, simple but solid, the kind that would give her warning if someone tried to force it. "Mr. Carter," she said, turning back. Daniel looked up from the dishes, water dripping from his hands. "Thank you." He nodded. Didn't smile, didn't offer platitudes about it being nothing, or tell her she was welcome, just acknowledged the words with a slight dip of his head and went back to washing plates. Martha entered the room and closed the door. The lock turned with a solid click. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the mechanism, testing the feel of it. Secure, private, under her own control. Then she crossed to the cot and sat down heavily, feeling every one of her 63 years in her bones and muscles. Through the window, the last light was fading from the sky, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. The mountains were dark shapes against the horizon. She lay back on the cot, not bothering to remove her shoes or the filthy dress. The pillow smelled like soap and sun-dried cotton. The quilt was exactly where Daniel had said it would be. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Martha Callahan slept without checking first to make sure she could run. Martha woke to the smell of coffee and the low sound of men's voices drifting through the wall. For a moment she lay still, disoriented, her mind cataloging details in the automatic way of someone who'd learned that knowing where you were when you opened your eyes could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Clean sheets, locked door, window showing pale dawn light. The ranch. She sat up slowly, her body protesting with a symphony of aches. The voices outside had stopped. She heard boots on wooden floorboards, then the sound of the front door closing. Through the small window, she could see two figures walking toward the barn. Daniel and another man, older and heavier, moving with the stiff gait of someone whose joints had logged too many years of hard use. Martha stood and tested the door lock again before opening it. The main room was empty, but the stove was warm and a pot of coffee sat at its edge. 2 cups were on the table, one clean and waiting. She poured coffee into it and drank standing up, looking out the window at the ranch yard bathed in early light. The desert had its own beauty at this hour, before the sun turned vicious. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of sage. The mountains were painted in shades of rose and amber. Everything felt suspended in that brief window between night's chill and day's heat, when the land seemed to exhale and gather itself for whatever was coming. Daniel emerged from the barn alone, carrying a bucket. He saw her through the window and lifted his hand in a brief acknowledgement, but didn't come to the house immediately. Instead, he walked to the chicken coop, a structure she hadn't noticed the night before, and disappeared inside. When he returned, the bucket was half full of eggs. He came through the door with the careful movements of a man trying not to startle. "Morning. Hope the coffee's all right. I tend to make it strong." "It's fine." Martha set down the cup. "Who was that with you?" "Samuel Pike. Works a neighboring spread about 5 miles west. Stops by sometimes when he's riding the fence line." Daniel set the bucket on the counter and began pulling out eggs, checking each one before setting it in a ceramic bowl. "Good man. Known him near 15 years now." "Does he know about me?" Daniel glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "He knows I brought someone back from town yesterday. Didn't press for details. Sam's not one for gossip." Martha moved to the window, watching the empty yard. "But he'll talk eventually. Word will spread that you've got a woman here." "Probably." Daniel cracked eggs into a pan with practiced efficiency. "Does that worry you?" "Should it worry you? People will make assumptions." "People always make assumptions." He added salt, a pinch of something that looked like dried herbs. "I stopped caring about that particular problem a long time ago." They ate breakfast in the same companionable silence as the night before. The eggs were good, cooked with bits of onion and pepper that gave them substance. Daniel had fried cornmeal cakes as well, and there was honey in a jar that had probably come from a wild hive somewhere in the canyon. When Martha stood to clear the plates, Daniel spoke. "You said one night, 'I understand if you want to move on, but the offer stands. You're welcome to stay longer if you haven't figured out where you're headed.'" Martha carried the plates to the wash basin. "And do what?" Exactly. Sit around while you pay for my room and board out of some misguided sense of redemption? Help with the ranch if you want, or don't. Up to you. He pushed back from the table. I'm not keeping score, Mrs. Callahan. I've got work that needs doing regardless of whether you're here or not. What kind of work? Today I need to ride out to the east pasture, check the water situation. Tank out there's been acting up, might be a crack in the lining. After that there's tack to mend, fence posts to replace, and about 6 other things I've been putting off because there's only so many hours in a day. He stood and reached for his hat. Like I said, you're welcome to stay. Or not. Either way, I'll be back by sundown. He left before she could respond, the door closing with a soft click that somehow felt more final than if he'd slammed it. Martha stood at the wash basin with her hands in cooling dishwater and stared at her reflection in the small mirror hung above it. The face looking back was deeply lined, gray-haired, marked by years that showed in every crease and shadow. An old woman. Worthless, according to yesterday's crowd. Too broken to matter. She dried the dishes and put them away, learning the organization of Daniel's kitchen through observation. Then she went back to the small room that had been hers for the night and stood looking at the narrow cot, the plain walls, the window with its view of mountains. She could walk away. Should walk away, probably. This situation had all the markers of something that would turn complicated and painful. A man trying to fix his past mistakes through proximity to her present suffering. It never worked that way. You couldn't save people backward through time, but the alternative was walking back into Mercy Wells with no money, no prospects, and the fresh memory of standing in chains while people laughed. Or heading in a different direction entirely, hoping to find work in another settlement before her resources, which currently consisted of the clothes on her back, ran out. Martha had made harder choices with worse odds. There was a shelf in the room with a few Ta pa quy nữ ma mai mi quy There was a shelf in the room with a few items she hadn't noticed in the dark. A comb with most of its teeth intact, a small square of polished metal that served as a mirror, a folded towel. She worked the tangles from her hair methodically, fighting the knots until her scalp ached, but her hair hung smooth. In the main room, she found what she was looking for, a mending basket tucked beside one of the chairs, full of shirts and trousers that needed buttons or patching. She settled into the chair and began working through them, her fingers finding the old rhythm of needle and thread. It had been one of her first jobs as a young woman, and the skill had never left her. Her stitches were small and even, nearly invisible against the fabric. By the time Daniel returned in the late afternoon, she'd mended 3 shirts, patched 2 pairs of trousers, and reattached every loose button she could find. The work sat in a neat stack on the table. Daniel stopped in the doorway, dusty and tired, and looked at the mended clothes. Then he looked at Martha. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said. "I know, did it anyway." He nodded slowly, hanging his hat on a peg. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I was sitting idle and I don't sit well. If I'm going to be here, I'll earn my keep." "You don't need to—" "Yes, I do." Martha's voice was firm. "I know you think you're doing this without expectation, Mr. Carter, and maybe that's even true. But I've lived too long to take charity without giving something back. So if I'm staying, I work. That's the arrangement." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "All right," he said finally. "If that's what you need." "It is." "Then we'll call it even." The days that followed developed a pattern. Daniel rose before dawn and spent his mornings working the ranch, fixing fence, managing livestock, maintaining equipment that broke down with the regularity of old machinery in hard country. Martha took over the household tasks without being asked, cooking meals that were more varied than Daniel's simple fare, keeping the place clean, managing the small garden that struggled gamely in the alkaline soil behind the house. They spoke little but worked in comfortable parallel. Two people who'd both learned that sometimes silence was easier than conversation. Martha proved herself capable in ways that surprised Daniel. She could doctor a lame horse, knew how to preserve food without it spoiling in the heat, could read weather and the color of the sky and the behavior of birds. The frontier had taught her practical skills that had nothing to do with her age and everything to do with survival. Samuel Pike returned on the third day, riding up to the house at mid-morning. He was a stocky man in his 60s with a face like worn leather and eyes that missed nothing. He touched his hat brim when he saw Martha. "Ma'am, name's Samuel Pike." "Martha Callahan." "Pleased to meet you proper." He turned to Daniel. "Came to let you know there's riders out near the canyon road. 3 men on good horses, asking questions in town yesterday about a woman brought back from the auction." The easy atmosphere in the ranch yard shifted immediately. Daniel's expression went flat and hard. "What kind of questions?" "The pointed kind. Who bought the contract, where the ranch is located, whether anyone knew the woman's history." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Didn't like the feel of it, so I rode out to give you warning." "Who sent them?" Martha's voice was steady, but her hand had gone to her throat in an unconscious gesture. "Didn't say, but they were carrying papers, talking about legal contracts and territorial obligation." Samuel looked at Daniel. "Mention the name Victor Crowley." Daniel swore softly. Martha felt her stomach drop. "You know that name?" Daniel asked her. "Everyone in 3 territories knows that name." Martha's hand fell to her side, fingers curling into a fist. "Victor Crowley owns half the mining interests between here and the Northern Territories. Contracts labor, controls transport, has judges and territorial officials in his pocket." She met Daniel's eyes. "If he's involved, this isn't about me specifically. It's about the principle. Someone challenged his system, and he won't let that stand." "The contract was legal," Samuel said. "Daniel bought it fair. What happens after that is his business." "Except I destroyed the contract." Daniel's voice was grim. "In front of witnesses. Made a spectacle of it." "You made him look weak," Martha said quietly. "Men like Crowley can't afford that. They maintain power through the appearance of absolute control. If word spreads that someone can just buy a contract and tear it up, others might try the same thing. The whole system he's built starts looking fragile." Samuel shifted his weight, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. "What do you want to do, Daniel?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Did these men say when they'd be riding out here?" "Soon, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but they'll come." "Then we prepare." Daniel looked at Martha. "You can leave if you want. Take a horse, ride to Pike's Spread, or head south toward the territorial border. I won't blame you for going." Martha laughed, a short, bitter sound. "And where exactly would I go? I've got no money, no documents, nowhere to run that Crowley couldn't find me if he wanted to. At least here there's a chance of making a stand. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. I'm the one who was standing in chains yesterday. That makes it mine as much as yours." She crossed her arms. "Besides, you spent your $1. I figure that buys you at least the courtesy of me staying to see how this plays out." Samuel cleared his throat. "I can bring some men if you need them. Got 2 ranch hands who know how to handle trouble." Daniel shook his head. "Appreciate it, Sam, but I won't ask you to risk your people. If this goes bad, I don't want it spreading to your place." "Might not be your choice to make." Samuel gathered his reins. "I'll keep watch for my side of the property. Anything looks wrong, I'll ride in. And Daniel?" He paused. "Be careful. Crowley doesn't send riders just to talk." After Samuel left, Daniel and Martha stood in the yard watching dust settle in the wake of his departure. The sun was climbing toward noon, heat beginning to press down like a weight. "You should have something to defend yourself with," Daniel said finally. "Can you shoot?" "Well enough." He led her to the house and from a locked cabinet produced a rifle and a pistol. The rifle was a Winchester, well maintained and clearly used regularly. The pistol was older, a heavy revolver that had seen better days but still had the solid feel of functional weaponry. "Take the pistol," Daniel said. "Keep it with you. If those riders come and things turn ugly, I need to know you can protect yourself." Martha took the weapon, checking the cylinder automatically, fully loaded. "You really think it'll come to shooting?" "I think men who work for Victor Crowley don't take no for an answer." Daniel's expression was grim. "And I think tearing up that contract embarrassed powerful people who aren't used to being embarrassed. So yes, I think it might come to shooting." They spent the afternoon preparing. Daniel checked the loads on his own weapons, made sure the barn and house had clear sight lines, positioned tools and supplies in places they could be reached quickly if needed. Martha worked beside him, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd prepared for trouble before. By evening, the ranch had the quiet tension of a place waiting for storm. Daniel cooked a simple dinner neither of them had much appetite for, and they ate watching the canyon road through the window. The sun set in shades of red and purple, painting the desert in colors that would have been beautiful if Martha had been in any state to appreciate them. Full dark had fallen when they heard the horses. 3 riders, just as Samuel had said, approaching at an easy pace that suggested confidence rather than caution. They stopped at the edge of the ranch yard, silhouetted against the starlit sky, and one of them called out, "Daniel Carter, we're here on official business. Need to speak with you about a contract dispute." Daniel stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely in one hand. "State your business and move on." The lead rider dismounted, a tall man in a coat too fine for ranch work. "Name's Harrison. I represent the interests of Mr. Victor Crowley. We have information that you interfered with a legal territorial contract yesterday, specifically a labor contract purchased at public auction. I bought that contract legal and fair. What I did with it afterward is my business." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Carter." Harrison's voice carried the smooth confidence of a lawyer or a professional negotiator. "Territorial contracts aren't personal property to be destroyed at will. They're legal instruments that bind both parties. By destroying the document, you violated territorial statute and created a legal liability." The woman was freed. That's the end of it. "Not quite." Harrison gestured, and one of the other riders produced a lantern, lighting it to cast harsh shadows across the yard. "We're here to recover the contracted party and return her to proper custody pending legal resolution." Martha stepped onto the porch beside Daniel, the pistol visible in her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." Harrison's eyes flicked to her, then back to Daniel. "Sir, I strongly advise you not to interfere with legal process. Mr. Crowley is prepared to be reasonable about this situation, but only if cooperation is immediate." "And if we refuse?" The third rider shifted in his saddle, and Martha caught the glint of metal, a rifle barrel reflecting lantern light. Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then we stop being reasonable and start following territorial law to the letter, which includes provisions for forcible recovery of contracted labor and penalties for those who obstruct justice." He paused. "Mr. Crowley is a patient man, but his patience has limits. The woman comes with us tonight, or this situation becomes significantly more complicated for everyone involved." Daniel's grip on his rifle tightened almost imperceptibly. "You're on my property, making threats. I could shoot you where you stand, and territorial law would call it justified." "You could try." Harrison's voice went cold. "But I've got 2 armed men with me, and Mr. Crowley has a dozen more who'd be here by dawn if anything happened to us. Is this really the fight you want to pick, Mr. Carter? Over a woman you bought for $1? The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Martha could feel violence gathering in the air like electricity before lightning. Her hand was steady on the pistol, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, hard sound that held no humor but all the edge of broken glass. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to get back on your horses and ride out of here. You're going to tell Victor Crowley that Martha Callahan is under my protection, and if he has a problem with that, he can bring it to the territorial court like a civilized man instead of sending hired guns in the night." I'm not finished." Daniel's voice cut through Harrison's objection like a knife. "You're going to do this because if you don't, I'm going to shoot your lantern out right now, and then we're going to have this conversation in the dark. And I know this land better than you do. Know every rock, every shadow, every place a man could hide or take cover. You think your odds are good when you can't see what you're shooting at?" Harrison's confident expression flickered. The man holding the lantern shifted nervously. Furthermore, Daniel continued, Sam Pike's ranch is 5 miles west, and he's got men watching this property tonight. You draw weapons here, they'll hear the shots and come running. So it won't be 2 against 1. It'll be 2 against 5 or 6 in the dark, on land you don't know. Still feel reasonable about your chances? It was a bluff. Samuel had offered men, but Daniel had refused them. But Harrison didn't know that, and the uncertainty showed in the way his hand hovered near his belt. Mr. Crowley won't accept this, Harrison said finally. Then Mr. Crowley can take it up with me directly. But tonight, right now, you're leaving my property. The standoff held for another long moment. Then Harrison stepped back and remounted his horse with careful, deliberate movements. This isn't over. Never thought it was. The 3 riders turned and rode back down the canyon road, the lantern swinging wildly as the man carrying it struggled to maintain his seat while controlling his nervous horse. Daniel and Martha stood on the porch watching until the light disappeared and the sound of hoofbeats faded to nothing. Only then did Martha release the breath she'd been holding. That was a hell of a bluff, she said quietly. Who says it was a bluff? Daniel lowered the rifle, his expression unreadable. Sam might have sent men without telling me. He's done it before. And if he didn't? Then we'd better hope Crowley decides to handle this through legal channels instead of coming back with more guns. He turned to face her. You understand what just happened, right? This isn't going away. Crowley's going to push harder now that someone pushed back. Martha nodded. I understand. And you're still staying? She looked out at the dark desert, then back at the ranch house with its warm lamplight spilling through the windows. Where else would I go? They went inside and barred the door, not because it would stop determined men, but because it would give warning. Daniel positioned himself in a chair with clear view of both the front door and the window, rifle across his lap. Martha took the other chair, pistol on the table beside her. Neither of them slept. Dawn came slowly, bleeding pale light across the eastern horizon like a wound opening in the dark. Martha had dozed fitfully in the chair, her neck stiff and her hand never far from the pistol. Daniel hadn't slept at all. She'd watched him through half-closed eyes, seeing the way he tracked every sound from outside, every creak of settling wood, every whisper of wind against the windows. When full daylight finally arrived, they both stood and moved through the house like people surfacing from deep water, stiff and uncertain. Daniel made coffee while Martha stepped onto the porch and scanned the ranch yard. Everything looked exactly as it had the night before. The barn, the corrals, the windmill turning in the morning breeze. But the normalcy felt wrong somehow, like a stage set waiting for actors to appear and turn it into something else. They'll be back, Martha said when Daniel handed her a cup of coffee. I know. Question is when and how many. Daniel leaned against the porch rail, squinting at the canyon road. Crowley's smart. He won't come with overwhelming force right away. That would look like exactly what it is, which is a rich man using violence to enforce his will. He'll try legal pressure first. Territorial marshal, maybe a judge if he's got one purchased. And when that doesn't work, then he'll stop being smart and start being angry. Daniel took a long drink of coffee. Men like Crowley don't handle defiance well. It eats at them. They were still standing on the porch when the rider appeared, coming fast from the direction of Samuel Pike's ranch. Martha's hand went to the pistol at her belt, but Daniel shook his head. That's Sam's youngest hand, Jesse. He wouldn't be riding that hard unless something was wrong. The young man pulled his horse up in a spray of dust and practically fell from the saddle, his face flushed with exertion and fear. Mr. Carter, Sam sent me to warn you. There's trouble coming. What kind of trouble? The kind with badges. Jesse was breathing hard, the words coming in rushes. Territorial Marshal rode into Mercy Wells last night with a warrant. Claims you're harboring stolen property. That's what he called her, ma'am. I'm sorry. And interfering with legal contracts. He's gathering men now, maybe a dozen, and they're planning to ride out here by noon. Daniel's expression went cold and flat. The marshal have a name? Denton. Thomas Denton. Never heard of him. That's because he's new to the territory, Martha said quietly. Appointed 6 months ago, and I'd bet my last dollar Victor Crowley had a hand in that appointment. Jesse nodded eagerly. That's what Sam said too. Said this whole thing stinks of Crowley money and Crowley influence, and you should be ready for them to push hard. Daniel set his coffee cup on the porch rail with careful precision. Tell Sam I appreciate the warning, and tell him to keep his people away from here when this goes down. No sense in good men getting hurt over my decisions. Sir, Sam said to tell you he's not sitting this out. Said you've been a good neighbor for 15 years and he's not about to... Tell him what I said, Jesse. I mean it. The young man looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Daniel's face stopped him. He mounted his horse with visible reluctance and rode back the way he'd come, glancing over his shoulder twice before the canyon walls swallowed him from view. Martha watched Daniel's profile, seeing the muscle jump in his jaw as he ground his teeth. You're not actually planning to face down a dozen armed men alone, are you? Not planning to face them down at all. Daniel turned to her. I'm planning to do exactly what that marshal wants. Hand you over peacefully and let the territorial courts sort out the legal questions. Martha stared at him. Like hell you are. It's the smart play. Let them take you into custody, make their case in front of a judge, and when it falls apart, because it will fall apart, I destroyed a contract I legally owned, you'll be released and this whole thing ends without bloodshed. You really believe that? Martha's voice was sharp with disbelief. You think Crowley's going to let this go to honest court proceedings? He'll have his judge ready, his witnesses bought, his verdict written before we ever set foot in a courtroom. And even if by some miracle we got a fair hearing, do you know what happens to women like me while we're waiting for trial? We get put in territorial holding facilities that are barely better than the contracts we were running from in the first place. Better than dying in a shootout. Is it? Martha stepped close to him, her gray eyes fierce. I've been property before, Daniel. Had my life owned by other people. My choices taken away. My dignity stripped until I was nothing but labor and obedience. I survived it, barely, and I swore I'd never let it happen again. So no, I'm not going peacefully. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. You mean that? Every word. He exhaled slowly, something that might have been resignation or respect or both. Then we'd better figure out how to make this count. But they spent the next 2 hours preparing. Daniel pulled every weapon he owned from the locked cabinet. 3 rifles, 2 pistols, a shotgun with a barrel worn smooth from use, and a hunting knife with a blade that looked like it could split bone. He checked the loads on everything, laid out ammunition in organized rows, positioned weapons at strategic points around the house and barn. Martha worked beside him, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who'd made peace with whatever was coming. She filled water buckets and positioned them around the house in case of fire. She gathered food that could be eaten without cooking and stored it in places they could reach quickly. She dragged furniture to create barriers that would provide cover without blocking movement. It was Samuel Pike who arrived next, just past mid-morning, with 2 ranch hands riding behind him. Can argue with me later, Sam said. Wright can argue with me later, Sam said. Right now, we've got work to do. Sam, I told Jesse, I know what you told Jesse, and I'm telling you that I've known you since you first came to this territory, watched you build this ranch from nothing, seen you treat people fair when fair wasn't common. So if you think I'm going to sit on my property and watch while a corrupt marshal and Crowley's hired guns come to take a woman who hasn't done anything wrong, you don't know me as well as I thought. Daniel looked like he wanted to keep arguing, but Martha spoke first. Thank you, Mr. Pike. Sam touched his hat brim. Ma'am. Now someone want to tell me what the plan is? There wasn't much of a plan, really. Make a stand, hope the show of force was enough to make the marshal reconsider, and if it came to shooting, try to survive long enough to make the cost too high for Crowley to think it was worth continuing. It was thin and desperate, the kind of plan that relied more on luck than strategy, but it was all they had. They positioned themselves carefully. Daniel and one of Sam's hands, a quiet man named Carlos, took positions in the barn with clear sightlines to the ranch yard. Sam and his other hand, a young firebrand called Red for the color of his hair, positioned themselves in the house. Martha insisted on staying in the house as well, despite Daniel's protests that she should be somewhere safer. There is nowhere safer, she pointed out, and I'm not sitting in a root cellar while other people fight my battle. Noon came and went. The sun climbed to its peak and began the slow descent toward evening. Heat pressed down on the ranch like a physical presence, making the air shimmer and dance. Sweat ran down Martha's back, soaking the dress she'd changed into that morning. She held the pistol Daniel had given her and tried not to think about the last time she'd pointed a weapon at another human being. It was nearly 2 o'clock when they heard the horses. The marshal came with 15 men, not 12. They rode in formation, organized and disciplined in a way that suggested military training, or at least professional experience. Marshal Denton rode at the front, a compact man in his 40s with a face like weathered granite and a badge that caught the sunlight. Behind him came Harrison, the man who'd visited the night before, along with others who had the look of hired guns rather than lawmen. They stopped at the edge of the ranch yard, maintaining careful distance. Denton surveyed the buildings with the expression of a man taking tactical stock, noting the positions of potential threats, calculating angles and cover. "Daniel Carter," he called out, his voice carrying authority without needing volume. "I'm Marshal Thomas Denton, and I'm here on official territorial business. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Martha Callahan and a warrant for your own arrest on charges of contract interference and obstruction of legal process. You need to surrender yourselves immediately." Daniel stepped out from the barn, rifle held loose but ready. "Let me see those warrants, Marshal. I'll show you the warrants when you're in custody and not before." "Then we've got a problem, because I'm not surrendering to anything I haven't seen in writing." Denton's expression hardened. "Mr. Carter, I'm trying to handle this peacefully. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." "Peacefully?" Daniel gestured at the 15 armed men. "You brought an army to arrest one old woman and a rancher. That doesn't look peaceful to me. The number of men I bring is my concern, not yours. Now, I'm going to ask one more time. Surrender yourself and the woman, and we can resolve this without violence. Show me legal warrants signed by a judge I've heard of, and I'll consider it." Denton's jaw tightened. He reached into his coat and produced 2 folded documents, holding them up, but not approaching. "Signed by Territorial Judge Marcus Whitmore this morning. Completely legal and binding." "Whitmore," Martha said quietly from inside the house. "That's Crowley's judge. Handles all the mining contracts and labor disputes in 3 territories." Sam swore under his breath. Daniel called back to Denton. "I want those warrants delivered here so I can read them properly. Send one man, unarmed, to bring them to the porch." "That's not how this works." "It is if you want this to end peacefully." The standoff stretched thin. Martha could see Denton calculating, weighing options, trying to determine how far to push before someone started shooting. Harrison leaned over and whispered something in the marshal's ear. Denton's face darkened further, but he nodded. "All right. One man, unarmed." He gestured to a younger deputy, who dismounted and walked slowly toward the house, hands visible and empty, the warrants held out in front of him like a white flag. The deputy made it to the porch and set the documents on the rail, then backed away just as slowly. Daniel crossed from the barn to retrieve them, never taking his eyes off the line of mounted men. He unfolded the papers and read quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. "These are garbage," he said finally. "Signed this morning, like you said, but the complaints are dated 3 days ago. That's before I even bought Martha's contract. So unless you've got time travel working for you, Marshal, these warrants are based on events that hadn't happened yet when they were supposedly filed." Denton shifted in his saddle. "Clerical error. The dates will be corrected once you're in custody. That's not how legal process works, and you know it." Daniel let the warrants fall to the ground. "You want to arrest me for something I actually did, come back with proper documentation, but you're not taking Martha Callahan anywhere based on fraudulent paperwork." "Mr. Carter, I'm losing patience." "Then we finally have something in common." Martha saw it before anyone else, the way Harrison's hand moved toward his belt, the signal he gave with a slight nod of his head. She opened her mouth to shout warning, but the words were drowned by the sudden crack of gunfire. The first shot came from one of the mounted men in the back, aimed high and meant to intimidate rather than kill, but it shattered the fragile restraint everyone had been maintaining, and suddenly the ranch yard exploded into chaos. Daniel dove for cover behind the water trough as bullets tore splinters from the barn wall behind him. Carlos returned fire from the barn loft, his shots measured and careful. Sam and Red opened up from the house windows, their rifles barking in rapid succession. Martha dropped below the window ledge as glass exploded above her head, fragments raining down on her shoulders. Her ears rang with the concussive force of gunfire in enclosed space. She raised the pistol Daniel had given her, aimed at a man trying to flank the house, and pulled the trigger. The recoil snapped her wrist back, but the shot flew true. The man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Not dead, but out of the fight. Martha felt a sick twist in her stomach but forced it down. This was survival now. Mercy was a luxury they couldn't afford. The fight was brutal and close. Nothing like the romanticized gunfights in dime novels. Men screamed when they were hit, horses panicked and threw riders. Dust and gun smoke turned the air thick and choking. Martha lost track of individual shots, everything blurring into a continuous roar of violence that seemed to stretch on forever and end in an instant simultaneously. When it finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Martha raised her head cautiously. The ranch yard looked like a battlefield. 3 of Denton's men were down, 2 clearly dead and 1 moaning as he clutched a leg wound that bled freely. Several horses had bolted entirely. The remaining men had pulled back to the canyon road, reorganizing behind whatever cover they could find. "Everyone all right?" Daniel called from behind the water trough. "I'm hit," Red answered, his voice tight with pain. "Not bad, but I'm bleeding pretty good." Martha crawled to where the young man sat slumped against the wall, blood seeping through his shirt from a wound high on his left shoulder. She tore strips from her skirt and packed the wound as well as she could, working quickly while keeping one eye on the windows. "You're going to be fine," she told him, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Bullet went clean through. "Just need to keep pressure on it." Outside, Denton was shouting orders to his men, trying to maintain control of a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond what he'd expected. Harrison was arguing with him, gesturing wildly toward the house. The marshal shook his head emphatically, but Harrison kept pushing. "They're planning something," Sam said, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. "And I don't think we're going to like it." He was right. 5 minutes later, they saw 2 of Denton's men circling wide, carrying something that reflected sunlight like glass. Martha's stomach dropped when she realized what it was. "Lamp oil," she breathed. "They're going to try to burn us out." Daniel swore and fired at the men, but they'd already ducked behind the barn. Moments later, smoke began rising from the back of the structure, gray at first, then darkening as the fire caught and spread. The wind was blowing toward the house, which meant that once the barn was fully engulfed, the flames would jump to the house with terrifying speed. "We need to move," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Everyone to the root cellar behind the house. It's stone-walled and partly underground. Fire won't reach it as quickly." "That's a trap," Martha argued. "We'll be cornered with no way out." "We're cornered now, and at least there we won't burn to death." Daniel was already moving, helping Red to his feet. "Come on, we don't have time to debate." They fled through the back door as flames began eating through the barn roof, the crackling roar of fire joining the smell of smoke that made breathing difficult. The root cellar was exactly what Daniel had described, a stone structure built into a small rise behind the house with thick walls and a heavy door that could be barred from inside. They tumbled into it just as the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. Carlos was the last one in, slamming the door and throwing the bar into place. The cellar went dark, except for thin lines of light around the doorframe and a small ventilation grate near the ceiling. "Now what?" Red asked, his voice shaky with pain and fear. "Now we wait," Daniel said, "and hope the fire burns itself out before it cooks us alive, or Denton's men decide to come check if we're dead yet." Martha sank down against the cool stone wall, her hands shaking as adrenaline began to drain from her system. Through the ventilation grate, she could see smoke rising thick and black against the sky. The home Daniel had built, the barn where he'd worked, everything was being consumed by flames set by men who claimed to represent justice. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This is my fault. If I'd just left that first morning—" "Don't," Daniel's voice was sharp. "This is Crowley's fault for being the kind of man who'd rather burn a ranch than admit he was wrong. It's Denton's fault for being corrupt enough to carry fraudulent warrants. It's the fault of every person in that crowd yesterday who laughed while you stood in chains. But it's not your fault for existing, and it's sure as hell not your fault for wanting to be free." The stone walls grew warm. Smoke began seeping through the ventilation grate, making them cough. Outside they could hear men shouting, the roar of flames, the occasional crack of timbers giving way. Martha closed her eyes and tried not to think about dying in a stone box while fire raged overhead. Then she heard something else. New voices, more gunfire, but different this time, organized and coming from multiple directions. "What the hell?" Sam moved to the door, pressing his ear against it. The sounds of fighting intensified, then gradually began to fade. Shouts of retreat, horses galloping away. Then, blessed silence except for the crackling of dying flames. A voice called out, muffled but recognizable. "Daniel! Martha! You folks still alive in there?" "That's Jesse," Sam said, relief flooding his voice. He threw off the bar and cautiously opened the door. Sunlight and smoke poured in together. Jesse stood in the yard with at least 20 men behind him. Ranch hands, townspeople, even the old gentleman Martha had seen turning away in disgust at the auction. They were armed with everything from proper rifles to old hunting muskets to farming tools that had been sharpened into makeshift weapons. "We heard the shooting," Jesse explained as they stumbled out of the cellar. "Figured you could use some help. Found these folks on the way. Turns out not everyone in Mercy Wells thinks Crowley should own the whole territory." Martha looked at the assembled faces. Weathered ranchers, storekeepers, farmers, even a few women holding weapons with the casual competence of frontier wives who'd defended homesteads before. They'd come when it mattered, when the cost of standing aside became higher than the risk of standing up. "Denton and his men rode off when they saw us coming," an older rancher said. "Left their wounded behind. Cowards." Daniel surveyed the smoking ruins of his barn, the damage to the house that was already starting to burn on one side. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." "We know what would have happened," Jesse said quietly. "Same thing that's been happening for years. Good people getting ground down by those with money and power, and the rest of us pretending we don't see it because it's easier than fighting." He looked at Martha. "But that stops today." One of the women stepped forward, someone Martha recognized from the crowd at the auction. "I'm ashamed I didn't speak up yesterday, ma'am. Ashamed I let them treat you that way. But I'm here now, if that counts for anything." Martha felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, but its opposite. Something warm and fierce that she hadn't felt in so long, she'd almost forgotten what to call it. Hope, maybe. Or just the simple recognition that she wasn't alone anymore. "It counts," she said. "It counts for everything." The work of putting out the remaining fires took the rest of the afternoon. Men formed bucket chains from the well, while women beat at smaller blazes with wet blankets. The barn was a total loss, reduced to a skeleton of charred timbers that would need to be cleared away before anything could be rebuilt. The house had caught along one wall, but they'd managed to contain the damage before it spread to the main structure. Black scorch marks climbed the exterior like fingers reaching for the roof, but the bones of the building remained sound. By evening, the ranch yard looked like a war zone. Ash covered everything in a fine gray powder. The wounded from Denton's group had been moved to Samuel Pike's ranch under guard. 2 dead had been wrapped and loaded onto a wagon for transport back to Mercy Wells. Red sat on the porch steps with his shoulder properly bandaged now by one of the women who'd apparently worked as a nurse during the war. He was pale but conscious, sipping water and trying to smile when anyone asked how he felt. Daniel moved through the crowd thanking people individually, his face showing the strain of the day, but also something else, a kind of quiet determination that hadn't been there before. When the older rancher who'd spoken earlier approached him, Martha noticed the way Daniel straightened as if preparing for another fight. "Name's William Thornton," the rancher said, extending a weathered hand. "Own a spread about 15 miles south. Wanted to say what happened here today was wrong, and a lot of us have been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Crowley's way of doing business." Daniel shook his hand. "Appreciate you coming when it mattered. Should have mattered sooner." Thornton's expression was grim. "We've all watched Crowley expand his operations, seen the way he treats the people working his mines and ranches, heard stories about the contract system and what happens to folks who get caught up in it. Most of us told ourselves it wasn't our concern as long as it didn't touch our own land." He looked at the burned barn. "But this proves it touches everyone eventually. A man like Crowley doesn't stop at property lines." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop pretending we can ignore this and hope it goes away." Thornton gestured to the assembled crowd. "There's maybe 30 people here right now who were willing to ride out and help when they heard shooting. That's 30 people who've decided they're tired of looking the other way. We pool together, stand unified. We might actually have enough weight to push back against Crowley's influence." Samuel Pike joined them, his face thoughtful. "You're talking about organizing, making this official." "I'm talking about survival," Thornton corrected. "Crowley's got the territorial government in his pocket, controls most of the mining interests, and has enough hired guns to intimidate anyone who objects. But he doesn't have everything. There's still independent ranchers, small business owners, people who remember when this territory wasn't run like Crowley's personal empire. We stand together, we might remind the territorial officials that they're supposed to represent all of us, not just the richest man in 300 miles. Martha listened from where she sat on the porch beside Red, her hands still trembling slightly from the aftermath of violence and fear. The conversation had the sound of something larger taking shape, a movement crystallizing around the catalyst of one burned barn and one old woman who'd refused to go quietly back into chains. "It won't be easy," Daniel said. "Crowley will fight back hard. Today was just the opening move." "We know." Thornton's voice was steady. "But easy hasn't kept any of us fed or safe so far. Maybe it's time to try difficult." They talked long into the evening, making plans and exchanging information about Crowley's various holdings and operations. Someone had brought food, cold chicken and biscuits, dried fruit and cheese, and it was shared around as people ate standing up, too wired from the day's events to sit still. Martha found herself surrounded by women who asked careful questions about her experience on the auction block, her time in contracts before that, the system that had allowed her to be bought and sold like livestock. She answered honestly, though it cost her something to dredge up those memories. The older woman who'd apologized earlier, her name was Catherine, Martha learned, sat beside her and held her hand while she talked, offering silent solidarity that somehow made the telling easier. "How many others are there like you?" Catherine asked quietly. "Women trapped in contracts they can't escape, treated like property instead of people?" "More than you'd want to know about." Martha's voice was rough. The auction in Mercy Wells was small, just territorial overflow, but in the mining camps, the railroad towns, anywhere Crowley has operations, there's dozens, maybe hundreds of people working under contracts that are basically slavery with legal paperwork. And the law allows this? The law is whatever Crowley says it is, long as he's paying the judges and marshals. Martha looked at the assembled faces, seeing horror and anger in equal measure. That's what you're really fighting if you go up against him. Not just one man, but an entire system built to benefit people like him while grinding everyone else down to nothing. One of the younger women spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "Then we change the system." "That's a nice thought," Martha said gently. "But systems don't change easy. They're built from laws and money and the kind of power that doesn't let go without a fight." "Everything worth doing requires a fight," the young woman countered. "My grandmother was property once, real property before the war ended that particular evil. She used to tell me that freedom isn't something you're given. It's something you take, and then you defend every single day for the rest of your life." She met Martha's eyes. "You took yours today. We're just helping you defend it." The words settled into Martha's chest like stones in a foundation, solid and anchoring. She'd spent so many years just surviving, just enduring, that the idea of actually fighting back, not just for herself, but as part of something larger, felt strange and terrifying and necessary all at once. Daniel eventually called the meeting to order, standing in the ranch yard with the burned barn behind him like a monument to what they were all risking. "I appreciate everyone coming out here today. You saved our lives, and I won't forget that. But William's right, this is bigger than one ranch or one woman or even one corrupt marshal. If we're going to do this, if we're really going to stand against Crowley's operation, we need to be smart about it." "What do you suggest?" someone called from the back. "Documentation, for one. We need to gather evidence of every fraudulent contract, every bribed official, every illegal practice Crowley's been using to build his empire. Written testimony from people who've been hurt by the system. Records of payments to judges and marshals. Anything that proves what we all know but can't prove in court." "Crowley controls the courts," another voice objected. "The territorial courts, yes, but there are federal judges, territorial governors who answer to Washington, politicians who might actually care about justice if we make enough noise." Daniel's expression was grim but determined. "It's a long shot, but it's better than just accepting that this is how things are going to be forever." "And in the meantime?" Samuel Pike asked. "While we're gathering evidence and hoping for federal intervention, what happens when Crowley sends more men? Because he will send more men. Ooh, we defend each other. Set up a network. If one ranch gets hit, everyone responds like you all did today. Make it too expensive for Crowley to pick us off one at a time." Thornton nodded slowly. Mutual Defense Pact. I can work with that, but we'll need organization, someone to coordinate information, keep track of who's where, make sure responses are fast enough to matter. I'll do it, Jesse volunteered immediately. I can ride between properties, carry messages, keep everyone connected. They talked through logistics until full dark had fallen, and people began drifting away to their own properties, promising to return with supplies and support. By the time the last wagon rolled out of the yard, only Samuel and his men remained along with Martha and Daniel. You should come stay at my place, Samuel offered, at least until you get the house properly secured again. Daniel shook his head. Appreciate it, Sam, but if we leave now, it looks like we're running. Besides, the house is still mostly intact. We can manage. After Samuel and his men finally departed, Martha and Daniel stood in the yard surveying the damage by moonlight. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, and the stars were obscured by a haze of ash that drifted on the night breeze. You really think we can win this? Martha asked quietly. I think we can make him regret starting it, Daniel replied. Whether that's the same as winning, I don't know. They worked by lamplight to make the house secure, boarding up the burned section and checking all the doors and windows. Daniel set his rifle by the front door and his pistol on the table beside his chair. Neither of them discussed sleeping arrangements. It was understood that neither would sleep much anyway. Martha made coffee while Daniel checked on the horses that had survived the fire, making sure they had feed and water. When he came back inside, he looked exhausted, the lines in his face deeper than they'd been that morning, his movements heavy with fatigue. You should rest, Martha said. So should you. I'm too old to pretend I'm going to sleep after a day like today. She poured coffee for both of them and sat at the table. Besides, someone needs to keep watch. Daniel sat across from her and wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, as if drawing warmth from it, though the night was still mild. Thank you for what you did today, for fighting instead of running. Didn't have much choice. You always have a choice. You could have told me to hand you over, avoid all this. Martha shook her head. I told you before. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. I meant it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the night sounds outside. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, lonely and wild. The windmill creaked on its axis, still turning despite everything. Tell me about your sister, Martha said eventually. If you want to talk about it. Daniel was quiet for so long she thought he might refuse. Then he started speaking, his voice low and careful, as if the words had sharp edges that could cut if handled wrong. Her name was Elizabeth. Everyone called her Lizzie. She had red hair like our mother and a temper to match it. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Used to drive our father crazy because she wouldn't do things the expected way. Wanted to learn to shoot, to ride like the ranch hands, to make her own decisions about her life. Sounds like someone I might have liked. You would have. Daniel's smile faded. She was strong and smart and absolutely certain she knew better than anyone else what was good for her, which made it easy for her to ignore my warnings about James Ketterman. That was the man who came through town promising California and prosperity. How old was she when she left? 16. Young enough that I should have known better than to let her go. Old enough that stopping her would have meant locking her in her room. He stared into his coffee cup. I was 21, barely managing the ranch after our parents died, trying to figure out how to keep us fed and the property from falling apart. When she said she was leaving, part of me was almost relieved. One less person to worry about, one less mouth to feed. That's natural. Doesn't make you responsible for what happened after. Doesn't make me innocent either. Daniel's jaw tightened. It took me 3 months to go after her. 3 months of telling myself she'd be fine, that she'd made her choice, and I had to respect it. By the time I tracked her down to a mining camp in Nevada, she was already sick. Consumption, the doctor said. But it wasn't just that. It was exhaustion and mistreatment and the kind of soul-deep weariness that comes from realizing you've been lied to and there's no way back to who you were before. Martha reached across the table and took his hand. He looked surprised, but didn't pull away. She lived another 2 years, Daniel continued. I got her out of the camp, brought her back here, tried to nurse her back to health. But the damage was done. She'd cough until she couldn't breathe, wake up screaming from nightmares she wouldn't talk about, spend days just staring at the wall like she'd forgotten how to be a person. His voice broke slightly. When she died, part of me was grateful she didn't have to hurt anymore. And I've hated myself for that gratitude ever since. Mercy isn't something to hate yourself for, Martha said quietly. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for people we love is accept when they're done fighting. Maybe, but I keep thinking if I'd fought harder at the beginning, she never would have had to fight at all. They sat holding hands across the table, two people bound by different kinds of grief and guilt, but united in the determination not to let those things define them anymore. Outside the window, the first hint of dawn was beginning to gray the eastern horizon. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. People from Mercy Wells and surrounding ranches came by with supplies, lumber to rebuild, food to replace what had been lost, tools and nails, and anything else they thought Daniel might need. Jesse rode back and forth carrying messages between properties, coordinating the defense network they'd agreed to establish. Martha found herself at the center of an unexpected community, women coming to talk with her about their own experiences with Crowley's contracts or seeking advice about how to protect themselves and their families. But underneath the activity, everyone was waiting for Crowley's next move, for Marshal Denton to return with more men, for the other shoe to drop. It came on the third morning in the form of a formal notice delivered by a nervous young clerk from the territorial office. Daniel read it with increasing anger, his knuckles white where he gripped the paper. "They're calling a hearing," he said finally. "Territorial Court in Mercy Wells, 3 days from now. Charges of destruction of legal property, assault on a territorial marshal, and harboring fugitive labor." He looked at Martha. "You're named as a fugitive. They're demanding you be turned over to territorial custody pending trial. Who signed the order?" "Judge Marcus Whitmore. Crowley's judge." Martha felt her stomach sink. This is a trap. They couldn't take us by force, so now they're trying to do it legally. Samuel, who'd been helping clear debris from the burned barn, came to read the notice over Daniel's shoulder. "If you don't show up, they'll issue a warrant for failure to appear. That gives Denton legal cover to come out here with as many men as he wants. And if we do show up, they'll arrest us the moment we set foot in town." Daniel crumpled the notice in his fist. "Either way, Crowley gets what he wants." "Unless we fight it properly," William Thornton said. He'd arrived that morning with a wagon full of lumber and 2 of his sons. "In court, with witnesses and legal representation. You know a lawyer who'll stand up to Crowley?" "I know 3 who might, if we can convince them this is a fight worth taking." Thornton's expression was calculating. "And I know how to make a public spectacle that's hard to suppress. Crowley might control the judge, but he doesn't control what people see and hear if we make enough noise." Over the next 3 days, they prepared not just a legal defense, but a strategy. Thornton reached out to his contacts in the territorial government, officials who weren't entirely in Crowley's pocket, journalists who might be interested in a story about corruption and abuse of power, even a territorial representative who'd been making noise about reform. Jesse carried messages to people who'd been hurt by Crowley's contract system, gathering written testimonies and sworn statements. Martha found herself at the center of it all, telling her story over and over to anyone who would listen. It got easier with repetition, but it never stopped hurting. The casual cruelty of the auction, the years before that spent in various forms of servitude, the way the system ground people down until they forgot they'd ever had the right to dignity. But something else was happening too. As she talked, others began sharing their own stories. A woman whose husband had died in one of Crowley's mines while working off a contract debt. A man who'd been forced into labor after being arrested on fabricated charges. A teenage girl who'd barely escaped a contract that would have trapped her in a situation too dark to speak about in polite company. The pattern became clear. Crowley's empire was built on exploitation, maintained through corruption, and defended by violence masquerading as law. And people were tired of it. On the morning of the hearing, they rode into Mercy Wells with an entourage. Not just Daniel and Martha, but Samuel and Thornton, Jesse and Red, who was still recovering but insisted on coming, Catherine and a dozen other women who'd decided their presence mattered, and at least 20 men from various ranches who wore their firearms openly and made it clear they weren't going to stand aside if the law decided to be unjust. The courthouse was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, more gathered outside the windows. Crowley sat in the front row with his lawyers. 3 of them, expensive-looking men in suits that probably cost more than most people in the room made in a year. Marshal Denton stood near the judge's bench, his face carefully neutral but his hand resting on his gun belt. Judge Whitmore entered, and the room fell silent. He was a heavy man in his 60s with the florid face of someone who enjoyed good food and better whiskey. "Come to order," he announced. "We are here to evaluate livestock." "This hearing will come to order," he announced. "We are here to address charges brought by Marshal Thomas Denton against Daniel Carter and Martha Callahan. Mr. Carter, you stand accused of destroying legal property, specifically a territorial labor contract. Mrs. Callahan, you are charged with violation of contract terms and evading lawful custody. How do you plead?" Before Daniel could respond, a voice called from the back of the room. "Point of order, Your Honor." Everyone turned. A man in a well-cut suit was standing, holding a leather case. He was younger than the other lawyers, with sharp eyes and the kind of smile that suggested he enjoyed a good fight. "And you are?" Whitmore demanded. "Thomas Brennan, attorney at law out of the territorial capital. I'm here representing Mr. Carter and Mrs. Callahan in this matter." He moved forward through the crowd, placing his case on the defendant's table with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "And I have several motions to file before we proceed with any plea." Whitmore's face darkened. "This is highly irregular." "What's irregular, Your Honor, is a hearing being called with 3 days' notice on charges that appear to have been filed retroactively." Brennan opened his case and produced a stack of papers. "I have here documented evidence that the original complaint in this matter was dated before the alleged offense occurred. I also have affidavits from multiple witnesses stating that the contract in question was purchased legally and therefore became the personal property of Mr. Carter to dispose of as he saw fit. The destruction of a binding labor contract is illegal regardless of ownership," one of Crowley's lawyers objected. "Perhaps we should clarify what makes a contract binding." Brennan's smile sharpened. "I have testimony from the auctioneer, Mr. Horace Talmadge, stating that Ms. Callahan was being sold under territorial vagrancy statute. However, territorial law requires vagrancy charges to be filed within 72 hours of detention. Mrs. Callahan was held for 8 days before auction. That makes the entire contract void from the beginning." The courtroom erupted in noise. Whitmore banged his gavel, but the damage was done. Martha felt Daniel's hand find hers under the table, squeezing tight. Brennan wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I have documentation that Mrs. Callahan was originally contracted in Colorado Territory under a mining labor agreement that expired 4 years ago. She should have been released then, but instead was transferred to another contract without her consent and without legal process. That makes every contract since then fraudulent, and any attempt to enforce them illegal detention." "This is outrageous," Crowley's lead lawyer sputtered. "These are baseless accusations." "They're documented facts," Brennan interrupted, "which I'm prepared to present in detail if this hearing proceeds. But I suspect Your Honor might prefer to review the evidence in chambers first, along with the additional documentation I have regarding other irregularities in the territorial contract system." The threat was clear. Push this case forward and Brennan would make public every piece of corruption he'd uncovered. Whitmore looked at Crowley, who sat stone-faced but with fury radiating from every line of his body. "We'll take a recess," Whitmore announced abruptly. "Reconvene in 1 hour." The courtroom exploded into conversation the moment he left. Martha sat stunned, barely able to process what had just happened. Daniel was grinning, and Thornton was shaking Brennan's hand vigorously. "How did you—" Martha started. "Mr. Thornton hired me 3 days ago," Brennan explained. "Sent me every piece of documentation you all gathered, plus a few things I dug up on my own. Turns out when you start pulling threads on Crowley's operation, the whole thing starts unraveling pretty quickly." "Crowley won't let this stand," Daniel said. "Probably not, but he also can't afford to have all his dirty laundry aired in open court. My guess is they'll try to negotiate a settlement, drop the charges in exchange for everyone keeping quiet about what we've found." Brennan's expression turned serious. "Question is whether you're willing to accept that." Martha looked around the packed courtroom, at all the faces watching them with expressions ranging from hope to anger to desperate need for someone to finally stand up to the power that had controlled their lives for so long. She thought about the women who'd shared their stories, the men who'd ridden out to defend the ranch, the community that had formed around one old woman's refusal to go quietly back into chains. "No," she said firmly. "No settlement. Make them answer for everything in open court. Let everyone see what they've been doing." Daniel nodded. I agree. Brennan smiled like a man who'd been hoping for exactly that answer. Then let's give them a show they won't forget. The hour recess stretched to 3. Word spread through Mercy Wells like wildfire. The hearing that was supposed to be a quick formality had turned into something else entirely, and people who'd been going about their daily business began drifting toward the courthouse to see what would happen next. The crowd outside swelled to nearly 100, merchants closing their shops to stand in the street, ranch hands riding in from surrounding properties after hearing the news from Jesse, who'd been racing between locations all morning. Inside the courthouse, Brennan used the time to prepare Martha for what was coming. They sat in a side room that smelled of old paper and dust, the lawyer spreading documents across a scarred wooden table while Daniel stood guard at the door. They're going to try to discredit you, Brennan said bluntly. Make you out to be a troublemaker, someone who's violated multiple contracts through her own choices. They'll paint a picture of a woman who refuses honest work and takes advantage of the system. Let them try. Martha's voice was steady. I've got nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. Every contract I was under, I worked harder than anyone had a right to expect. What happened after that, the transfers, the extensions, the refusals to honor terms? None of that was my doing. Can you prove it? I can tell the truth. Whether people choose to believe it is up to them. Brennan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Good. Because the truth is the strongest weapon we have right now, and you're going to need to wield it like a sword. When Judge Whitmore finally reconvened the hearing, his expression had shifted from imperious to carefully controlled anger. Crowley sat beside his lawyers with the rigid posture of a man barely containing fury. Marshal Denton looked uncomfortable, his hand no longer resting casually on his gun belt but clasped tight in his lap. After reviewing the motions filed by Mr. Brennan, Whitmore said, his voice clipped and formal, this court has determined that certain procedural questions need to be addressed before we can proceed with the charges as filed. However, he paused, clearly choosing his words with care. The court maintains that the fundamental issue of contract destruction remains valid and must be answered. Then let's answer it, Brennan said, standing. I call Martha Callahan to testify. Martha rose and walked to the witness chair with her back straight and her head high. Every eye in the courtroom followed her. She placed her hand on the Bible they offered for the oath, swore to tell the truth, and sat down feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing down on her shoulders. Brennan began gently. Mrs. Callahan, can you tell the court how you came to be on the auction block in Mercy Wells 5 days ago? Martha took a breath and began. She told them about the mining contract in Colorado that had promised fair wages and decent conditions, but delivered neither. About working 16-hour days in the company laundry, the pay that barely covered the cost of room and board that the company controlled, the debt that somehow grew instead of shrinking no matter how hard she worked. She described the day the original contract expired and how instead of being released, she'd been told the debt needed to be settled first, then transferred to another contractor without her consent or signature. Her voice remained steady as she recounted the next contract, and the one after that, each transfer adding new terms she'd never agreed to, each new employer finding reasons to extend the obligation or add penalties. She spoke of the gradual realization that she was trapped in a system designed to never let her go, that freedom was always just one more year away, one more debt payment, one more impossible condition. And how did you end up under vagrancy charges? Brennan asked. I ran. Martha met the eyes of people in the courtroom as she spoke. After 8 years of being passed from contract to contract like property, I finally understood that playing by their rules would never result in freedom. So I left. Walked away from the last contract with nothing but the clothes I was wearing. Made it about 2 weeks before I was picked up by territorial authorities in a town I don't even remember the name of. They said running from a contract was vagrancy, put me in a holding cell for 8 days, then brought me here to be sold. Did anyone explain your legal rights during this time? No one explained anything. I was told to shut up, do what I was told, and be grateful anyone would bid on a woman my age at all. Crowley's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is providing editorialized testimony designed to generate sympathy rather than establish facts. The facts are that I spent 63 years of my life being treated like something less than human, Martha said before Whitmore could respond. If that generates sympathy, maybe it should. A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Whitmore banged his gavel, but without much conviction. The witness will confine herself to answering the questions asked. Brennan continued. Mrs. Callahan, when Mr. Carter purchased your contract and then destroyed it, what did you understand that to mean? I understood it to mean I was free, that for the first time in longer than I could remember, my life belonged to me again. And have you since entered into any new contracts or obligations? No, I've helped Mr. Carter with his ranch because I chose to, not because I was compelled. That's what freedom looks like, making choices instead of having them made for you. Crowley's lawyer stood for cross-examination with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed he held winning cards. His name was Silas Montgomery, and he had the kind of polished appearance that came from years of winning cases through intimidation rather than merit. Mrs. Callahan, you say you ran from a valid contract. Isn't that theft of services? I don't know. Is it theft when you're never paid what you were promised? You admit you were provided room and board. At prices set by the contractor, deducted from wages before I ever saw them, always calculated to keep me in debt. That's not payment, Mr. Montgomery. That's a shell game designed to look legal while functioning like slavery. Montgomery's face reddened. You're making serious accusations. I'm telling the truth about how the contract system actually works. If that sounds like a serious accusation, maybe you should ask yourself why. The courtroom erupted in applause. Whitmore banged his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, but the damage was done. Martha had named the thing everyone knew, but rarely spoke aloud, and the room's energy had shifted decisively in her favor. Montgomery tried a different approach. You claim to have worked honestly, yet you've been through multiple contracts with different employers. Doesn't that suggest you're the problem, not the system? No, it suggests the system is designed to transfer people like property when one employer gets tired of them or finds someone younger to exploit. I didn't choose those transfers. They were done to me, without my consent, treating me like a piece of equipment that could be sold or traded at will. Can you prove you didn't consent? Can you prove I did? Show me a signature, Mr. Montgomery. Show me any document where I agreed to be moved from Colorado to Nevada, from Nevada to Utah, from Utah to this territory. I'll wait. Montgomery shuffled papers with visible frustration. The contracts themselves were signed by the employers, not by me. They signed documents transferring me like I was a wagon or a mule. And the law allowed it because the law was written by people who benefit from that system. Your Honor, the witness is making political statements rather than testifying to facts. The political statement is that a human being can be bought for $1 and everyone in this room thinks that's normal. Martha's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip crack. The political statement is that an old woman can stand in chains while people laugh at the idea she might have value. The fact is that I lived through it, and I'm not going to pretend it was anything other than what it was just to make this court comfortable. The courtroom exploded again, but this time Whitmore's gavel couldn't restore order. People were standing, shouting support or objection, the careful decorum of legal proceedings dissolving into something rawer and more honest. Daniel moved closer to Martha, his hand on his gun, ready to protect her if the chaos turned violent. Brennan seized the moment. Your Honor, I have additional witnesses who can corroborate Mrs. Callahan's testimony about the contract system. People who've experienced the same treatment, the same fraudulent transfers, the same impossible conditions designed to keep them trapped indefinitely. This court will not be turned into a political forum, Whitmore started. Then dismiss the charges, Brennan interrupted, because if you insist on prosecuting Mrs. Callahan for seeking freedom from an illegal system, we're going to present every piece of evidence we have about how that system actually operates. And I guarantee you, Your Honor, that's going to be very political indeed. Crowley stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow. The message was clear. He was done pretending this was about justice or law. It was about power, and he was taking his elsewhere. Whitmore watched him go with an expression that might have been relief. This hearing is adjourned pending review of new evidence. The court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The gavel came down with finality, and the crowd surged forward, everyone trying to talk at once. Martha found herself surrounded by people thanking her, touching her arm, telling her their own stories in rushed whispers. Daniel and Samuel formed a protective barrier around her, gently but firmly guiding her toward the exit. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted Mercy Wells in shades of amber and gold. The street was packed with people, and when Martha emerged from the courthouse, they began to applaud. It started with one person, then spread like ripples in water until the entire crowd was clapping, cheering, some crying openly at what they'd witnessed. Catherine pushed through the crowd and embraced Martha, her tears soaking into Martha's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Other women joined them, forming a circle of solidarity that felt stronger than any legal document. These were the wives and daughters and sisters who'd watched the contract system devour people they loved, who'd felt powerless to stop it, and who were now seeing that powerlessness challenged for the first time. Brennan found them an hour later at the boarding house where they'd taken rooms. He looked tired but satisfied, carrying a leather case stuffed with papers. "Crowley's lawyers approached me an hour ago," he said without preamble. "They're offering a settlement. All charges dropped against both of you, a payment of $500 for the damage to your property, and a formal apology from the territorial office." "In exchange for what?" Daniel asked. "Your silence. No more testimony, no more public statements, no pursuit of the broader investigation into the contract system." Brennan set his case on the table. "They want this to go away quietly." Martha and Daniel exchanged glances. $500 would rebuild the barn, and then some. The charges being dropped would mean they could return to normal life without looking over their shoulders. It was more than most people in their position could hope to achieve. "What happens to everyone else?" Martha asked. "All the people still trapped in contracts, still being transferred and exploited and treated like property?" "Nothing changes for them," Brennan admitted. "Crowley keeps operating the same way, maybe gets a little more careful about the paperwork, but fundamentally, nothing changes." "Then no." Martha's voice was firm. "We didn't come this far to accept a payoff and pretend the problem is solved." "You understand what you're choosing?" Brennan leaned forward. "Crowley's not going to take rejection well. He'll fight this with everything he has, could drag on for months, maybe years, and there's no guarantee we win in the end." "There's never a guarantee," Daniel said, "but at least we'll have tried." Brennan smiled slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been doing some more digging, and what I found is going to make Crowley very, very uncomfortable." He opened his case and spread documents across the table. Financial records, contract transfers, communications between Crowley and various territorial officials. The picture they painted was damning, a systematic operation built on fraud and corruption, maintained through bribery and intimidation, enriching Crowley and his associates while grinding hundreds of people through a system that was designed to never let them escape. "This goes beyond labor contracts," Brennan explained. "He's been manipulating mining claims, forcing small operators to sell at below market prices, using territorial law enforcement as his private security. The contract system is just one piece of a much larger operation." "Can we prove it in court?" Samuel asked. He joined them along with William Thornton, both men understanding that this fight was bigger than one ranch or one woman. "We can prove enough to raise serious questions. And once those questions are being asked publicly, other people will come forward with their own evidence. That's how these things work. The first person to speak up gives everyone else permission to do the same." They worked through the evening, preparing testimony and organizing evidence. Word spread through Mercy Wells about the rejected settlement, and people began arriving at the boarding house offering support. A merchant brought food. A blacksmith offered the use of his shop if they needed a secure place to meet. Even the owner of the boarding house refused payment for their rooms, saying it was the least she could do. By midnight, they had a strategy. They would reconvene the hearing tomorrow and present everything, not just Martha's case, but the full scope of Crowley's operation. They would call witnesses, submit documentation, and force the territorial court to either address the corruption or reveal itself as complicit in it. It was risky. It would make powerful enemies, but it was also the right thing to do. And sometimes that was enough reason to try. Martha finally retreated to her room near 2 in the morning, exhausted but unable to sleep. She stood at the window looking out at the dark street, thinking about all the choices that had led to this moment. Running from that last contract, walking into Daniel's ranch instead of past it, choosing to fight instead of accepting the settlement. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Daniel stood in the hallway, looking as tired as she felt. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. Too much to think about. He nodded. I wanted to give you something. He held out his hand, and in his palm was the silver dollar, the one he'd used to buy her contract 5 days ago. Martha stared at it. Why? Because that coin represents the moment everything changed. Not just for you, but for all of us. It proved that the system could be challenged, that freedom could be claimed even when the whole world said it couldn't. He pressed it into her hand. Keep it. Remember what it cost and what it's worth. Martha closed her fingers around the coin, feeling its weight. Thank you. For everything. For spending this dollar, for defending me, for believing I was worth the trouble. Well, you were never trouble, Martha. You were the catalyst we all needed to finally do something about a system we'd been tolerating for too long. The hearing the next morning drew an even larger crowd. People packed the courtroom to capacity, spilled into the hallway, gathered in the street outside to hear secondhand reports from those close enough to the windows. Brennan called witness after witness, people who'd been trapped in contracts, families who'd lost members to the system, even a few former Crowley employees willing to testify about practices they'd been ordered to implement. Each story added another brushstroke to the larger picture of corruption and exploitation. A young man who'd been contracted at 16 and was now 28 with no end in sight. A widow whose husband had died in a mine accident and been told his contract debt would be transferred to her and her children. An elderly man who'd spent 12 years working off a debt that should have been settled in 3. Judge Whitmore grew increasingly pale as the testimony continued. Crowley's lawyers objected repeatedly, but their objections sounded hollow against the weight of human suffering being described in careful, devastating detail. By midday, even Whitmore seemed to understand that this had moved beyond his ability to control. During a brief recess, Brennan was approached by a territorial official Martha didn't recognize, a well-dressed man who introduced himself as Assistant Territorial Governor James Walsh. I've been listening to this testimony, Walsh said quietly, and I think it's time the territorial government took a more active interest in how the contract system is being administered. Interesting timing, Brennan replied dryly. Perhaps, but better late than never. Walsh glanced toward where Crowley sat with his lawyers, stone-faced but visibly shaken. I'm prepared to order an investigation into all territorial labor contracts, with particular focus on practices of fraudulent transfer and debt manipulation. I'm also prepared to recommend suspension of Judge Whitmore pending review of his decisions in contract cases over the past 5 years. And what do you want in return? Nothing, except perhaps to salvage what remains of the territorial government's credibility before this becomes a federal issue. Walsh met Brennan's eyes. Make no mistake, what you've exposed here is going to have consequences far beyond this courtroom. My choice is whether to be part of the solution or be swept away with the problem. When the hearing reconvened, Walsh made his announcement publicly. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause that even Whitmore didn't try to suppress. Crowley stood and walked out for the second time, but this time there was no mistaking the defeat in his posture. Whitmore dismissed all charges against Martha and Daniel, his voice barely audible over the continuing celebration. It was over. Not just their case, but the larger battle they'd been fighting. The weeks that followed brought change that rippled across the territory like stones thrown into still water. The investigation Walsh ordered uncovered widespread corruption, resulting in the removal of 3 judges and 4 territorial marshals, including Denton. Crowley's mining operations were placed under federal oversight pending review of labor practices. Hundreds of fraudulent contracts were voided, people freed from obligations that should have ended years earlier. It wasn't perfect. Some of Crowley's associates escaped consequences. Some practices continued under different names. But the system that had seemed immovable and eternal had been shaken to its foundations, and people who'd spent years believing they were powerless discovered they had voices, and those voices mattered. Martha and Daniel returned to the ranch to find the community had rebuilt the barn in their absence, a structure even larger and sturdier than the original, a monument to what collective action could achieve. The burned section of the house had been repaired and expanded, creating space for the people who began arriving seeking refuge. They came in 1s and 2s at first, then in larger numbers as word spread. Women fleeing bad contracts, families displaced by Crowley's collapsing operations, people who'd heard about the ranch where an old woman and a quiet rancher had stood up to power and won. The ranch became a way station and a sanctuary, a place where people could catch their breath and figure out their next steps without fear. Martha found herself in the unlikely role of advisor and advocate, using her experience to help others navigate the tangled web of territorial law and contract disputes. She was good at it, fierce and uncompromising when dealing with officials, gentle and patient with those who came seeking help. Daniel worked beside her, providing the practical support of food and shelter, while she provided the emotional support of someone who truly understood what they'd survived. Samuel Pike became a regular presence, his ranch serving as part of the network they'd built. William Thornton organized the independent ranchers into a cooperative that gave them collective bargaining power against large operations. Catherine and the other women formed a mutual aid society that provided support for families affected by the contract system's collapse. It was Jesse who brought the news 6 months later, writing in with a newspaper from the territorial capital. The headline read, "Federal Investigation Expands Crowley Mining Interests Under Review for Contract Fraud and Corruption." "They're saying it's the biggest scandal in territorial history," Jesse said, his young face alight with excitement. "And they're tracing it all back to what happened here, to Martha's testimony and everything you folks uncovered." Martha read the article slowly, seeing her own words quoted, her name mentioned alongside Daniel's and Brennan's as the people who'd brought the whole corrupt system to light. It felt strange seeing her life reduced to newspaper text, her suffering transformed into political narrative. But if that suffering could prevent others from experiencing the same thing, maybe it was worth it. Spring arrived with the kind of gentle beauty that made the desert briefly seem like paradise. Wildflowers bloomed across the canyon walls, painting the red stone with splashes of yellow and purple. The ranch thrived, expanded beyond what Daniel had ever managed alone. The barn held twice the livestock, the garden produced enough to feed everyone with surplus to sell in town, and the main house had grown to accommodate the constantly shifting population of people passing through on their journey toward whatever came next. Martha stood on the porch one morning watching the sun rise over the mountains, the same view she'd seen that first dawn after Daniel had freed her from chains. So much had changed since then, both in the world around her and in herself. The woman who'd stood in defeat on that auction platform felt like a stranger now, someone she remembered but no longer fully recognized. Daniel joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, in the ritual they'd maintained every morning for months. "Thinking about what comes next?" he asked. "Thinking about how far we've come." Martha accepted the coffee, its warmth seeping into her hands. "6 months ago, I was standing in chains while people laughed. Now I'm standing free in a place I can call home, surrounded by people I helped save and who saved me in return." "You did this, Martha. You and your refusal to accept that things couldn't change." "We did this," she corrected. "You spent that dollar. Everyone else who stood up when it mattered. None of us could have done it alone." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light paint the desert in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the house behind them, people were waking up. A family who'd arrived last week from a collapsed mining camp, a young woman recovering from contract injuries, an elderly man who'd finally been freed after 15 years of fraudulent obligation. Each of them with their own story, their own journey, their own chance at the freedom Martha had fought so hard to claim. Daniel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the silver dollar, the same coin he'd given her that night before the hearing. "I've been thinking about this," he said, "about what it represents. $1 for a human life, the cheapest purchase that ever mattered. Or the most valuable." Daniel held it up to the light. "This coin bought your freedom, which led to a fight that freed hundreds of others, which exposed corruption that's now being addressed across 3 territories. That's one hell of a return on investment." Martha smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and eased the lines in her weathered face. "So what do we do with it?" "We remember." Daniel pressed the coin into her hand again, closing her fingers around it. "We remember that sometimes the greatest changes start with the smallest acts. That one person standing up can give permission for everyone else to do the same. That freedom is always worth fighting for, no matter how impossible it seems." Martha looked at the coin, then at the ranch yard where people were beginning to emerge for the day's work, then at Daniel's face with its quiet strength and hard-won peace. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the pain and fear and desperate choices that had seemed like endings but turned out to be beginnings. "You know what this place needs?" she said suddenly. "What's that?" "A name. Every sanctuary should have a name so people know what they're looking for when they need it. Daniel considered this. You have something in mind? Martha thought about the silver dollar, about the price of freedom and the value of human dignity, about the community they'd built from the ruins of a corrupt system. Silver Hope Ranch, she said, because hope was the most expensive thing this dollar ever bought, and the only thing worth more than freedom itself. Silver Hope Ranch. Daniel tested the words, then nodded. I like it. They stood together on the porch as the sun climbed higher and the day truly began. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by a single silver dollar and became something more. Partners in a fight that wasn't finished but was finally moving forward. Friends who understood that the deepest bonds are forged in the crucible of shared struggle. Survivors who'd discovered that the opposite of suffering wasn't comfort but purpose. The ranch would continue to grow. More people would come seeking refuge and find not just shelter, but community. The changes they'd sparked would ripple outward, reaching places and people they'd never meet. Crowley's empire would eventually collapse entirely under the weight of investigation and public scrutiny. The contract system wouldn't disappear overnight, but it would be reformed and restricted until it bore some resemblance to actual justice rather than legalized exploitation. But all of that was future, and right now was enough. Martha slipped the silver dollar into her pocket where she could feel its weight against her leg, a constant reminder of where she'd been and how far she'd come. The coin that had bought her freedom sparked a revolution and proved that sometimes the most valuable things come with the smallest price tags. In the distance, the windmill turned steadily in the morning breeze, its familiar creak a heartbeat that measured time in moments instead of contracts. The desert stretched out in all directions, vast and beautiful and unforgiving, the same land that had tested her and nearly broken her now, offering space to build something new. And standing there with Daniel beside her and purpose burning steady in her chest, Martha Callahan, who had been property and labor and a woman too old to matter, understood that she had become something the world tried to take from her and failed. She had become free.